Part 1. Continued. Cassette 6, Side 2. As schools multiplied and literacy rose, the demand for books increased. The business classes found literacy useful in the operations of industry and trade. Women of the middle and upper classes escaped, through reading, into a world of compensatory romance. By 1300 the time had passed when only the clergy could read. It was this rising demand, even more than the increased supply of paper and the development of an oily ink, that led to Gutenberg. Moslems had brought paper manufacture to Spain in the 10th century, to Sicily in the 12th. It passed into Italy in the 13th, into France in the 14th. The paper industry was 100 years old in Europe when printing came. In the 14th century, when linen clothing became customary in Europe, cast-off linens provided cheap rags for paper. The cost of paper declined, and its readier availability cooperated with the extension of literacy to offer a material and market for printed books. Printing itself, as imprinting, was older than Christianity. The Babylonians had printed letters or symbols upon bricks, the Romans and many others upon coins, potters upon their wares, weavers upon cloths, bookbinders upon book covers. Any ancient or medieval dignitary used printing when he stamped documents with his seal. Similar methods had been employed in the production of maps and playing cards. Block printing, by blocks of wood or metal engraved with words, symbols, or images, goes back in China and Japan to the 8th century, probably beyond. The Chinese in this way printed paper money in or before the 10th century. Block printing appeared in Tabriz in 1294, in Egypt toward 1300. But the Muslims preferred calligraphy to printing and did not serve in this case, as in so many others, to carry cultural developments from the East to the West. Typography, printing with separate and movable type for each character or letter, was used in China as early as 1041. In 1314, Wang Chen employed nearly 60,000 movable wooden type characters to print a book on agriculture. He had tried metal type first, but had found that it did not take or hold ink as readily as wood. Movable type, however, offered little advantage or convenience to a language that had no alphabet, but had 40,000 separate characters. Consequently, block printing remained customary in China till the 19th century. In 1403, a Korean emperor printed a large number of volumes from movable metal type. Characters were engraved in hard wood, molds of porcelain paste were made from these models, and in these molds metal type were cast. In Europe, printing from movable type may have developed first in Holland. According to Dutch traditions not traceable beyond 1569, Lawrence Koster of Haarlem printed a religious manual from movable metal type in 1430, but the evidence is inconclusive. Nothing further is heard of movable type in Holland till 1473, when Germans from Cologne set up a press in Utrecht. But these men had learned the art in Mainz. Johann Gutenberg was born there, of a prosperous family, about 1400. His father's name was Gensfleisch, gooseflesh. Johann preferred his mother's maiden name. He lived most of his first 40 years in Strasbourg, and appears to have made experiments there in cutting and casting metal type. Toward 1448, he became a citizen of Mainz. On August 22, 1450, he entered into a contract with Johann Fust, a rich goldsmith, by which he mortgaged his printing press to Fust for a loan of 800 guilders, later raised to 1,600. A letter of indulgence issued by Nicholas V in 1451 was probably printed by Gutenberg. Several copies exist, bearing the oldest printed date, 1454. In 1455, Fust sued Gutenberg for repayment. Unable to comply, Gutenberg surrendered his press. Fust carried on the establishment with Peter Schoeffer, who had been employed by Gutenberg as a typesetter. Some believe that it was Schoeffer who had by this time developed the new tools and technique of printing. A hard punch of engraved steel for each letter, number, and punctuation mark, a metal matrix to receive the punches, and a metal mold to hold the matrix and letters in line. In 1456, Gutenberg, with borrowed funds, set up another press. From this he issued, in that year or the next, what has been generally considered his first type-printed book, the famous and beautiful Gutenberg Bible. A majestic folio of 1,282 large, double-columned pages. In 1462, Mainz was sacked by the troops of Adolf of Nassau. The printers fled, scattering the new art through Germany. By 1463 there were printers in Strasbourg, Cologne, Basel, Augsburg, Nuremberg, and Ulm. Gutenberg, one of the fugitives, settled in Eltville, where he resumed his printing. He struggled painfully through one financial crisis after another, until Adolf gave him, in 1465, a benefice yielding a protective income. Some 3 years later he died. Doubtless his use of movable type would have been developed by others had he never been born. It was an obvious demand of the times. This is true of most inventions. A letter written in 1470 by Guillaume Fichet of Paris suggests how enthusiastically the invention was welcomed. There has been discovered in Germany a wonderful new method for the production of books, and those who have mastered the art are taking it from Mainz out into the world. The light of this discovery will spread from Germany to all parts of the earth. But not all welcomed it. Copyists protested that printing would destroy their means of livelihood. Aristocrats opposed it as a mechanical vulgarization and feared that it would lower the value of their manuscript libraries. Statesmen and clergy distrusted it as a possible vehicle of subversive ideas. It made its triumphant way nevertheless. In 1464, 2 Germans set up a press in Rome. In or before 1469, 2 Germans opened a printing shop in Venice. In 1470, 3 Germans brought the art to Paris. In 1471, it reached Holland. In 1472, Switzerland. In 1473, Hungary. In 1474, Spain. In 1476, England. In 1482, Denmark. In 1483, Sweden. In 1490, Constantinople. Nuremberg with the Coburger family, Paris with the Etienne, Lyon with Dolé, Venice with Aldus Manutius, Basel with Amerbach and Froben, Zurich with Froschauer, Leiden with the Elzevers, became humming hives of printing and publishing. Soon half the European population was reading as never before, and a passion for books became one of the effervescent ingredients of the Reformation age. At this very moment, writes a Basel scholar to a friend, a whole wagon-load of classics, of the best Alden editions, has arrived from Venice. Do you want any? If you do, tell me at once and send the money, for no sooner is such a freight landed than 30 buyers rise up for each volume, merely asking the price and tearing one another's eyes out to get hold of them. The typographical revolution was on. To describe all its effects would be to chronicle half the history of the modern mind. Erasmus, in the ecstasy of his sales, called printing the greatest of all discoveries, but perhaps he underestimated speech, fire, the wheel, agriculture, writing, law, even the lowly common noun. Printing replaced esoteric manuscripts with inexpensive texts rapidly multiplied in copies more exact and legible than before, and so uniform that scholars in diverse countries could work with one another by references to specific pages of specific editions. Quality was often sacrificed to quantity, but the earliest printed books were in many cases models of art in typography and binding. Printing published, that is, made available to the public, cheap manuals of instruction in religion, literature, history, and science. It became the greatest and cheapest of all universities, open to all. It did not produce the Renaissance, but it paved the way for the Enlightenment, for the American and French revolutions, for democracy. It made the Bible a common possession and prepared the people for Luther's appeal from the popes to the Gospels. Later it would permit the rationalists' appeal from the Gospels to reason. It ended the clerical monopoly of learning, the priestly control of education. It encouraged the vernacular literatures, for the large audience it required could not be reached through Latin. It facilitated the international communication and cooperation of scientists. It affected the quality and character of literature by subjecting authors to the purse and taste of the middle classes, rather than to aristocratic or ecclesiastical patrons. And after speech, it provided a readier instrument for the dissemination of nonsense than the world has ever known until our time. Chapter 8. The Western Slavs, 1300 to 1517. Heretofore the Slavs had been human flotsam, surging westward at times to the Elbe, southward to the Mediterranean, eastward to the Urals, north even to the Arctic Sea. Then, in the 13th century, repulsed in the west by the Livonian and Teutonic Knights and subjected to Mongol and Tatar domination in the east. In the 14th century, Bohemia led the Holy Roman Empire and the pre-Lutheran Reformation. and Poland, united with the vast Lithuania, became a major power with a highly cultured upper class. In the 5th century, Russia freed herself from the Tatars and unified her far-flung principalities into a massive state. Like a tidal wave, the Slavs entered history. In 1306, the death of Wenceslas III ended the ancient Przemyslid line in Bohemia. After an interlude of minor kings, the baronial and ecclesiastical electors brought in John of Luxembourg to found a new dynasty in 1310. His gallant adventures made Bohemia for a generation an unwilling citadel of chivalry. He could hardly live without tournaments, and when these proved too innocuous, he sallied forth to war in almost every realm of Europe. It became a bon mot of the times that nothing can be done without the help of God and the King of Bohemia. Brescia, besieged by Verona, begged his aid. He promised to come. At the news thereof, the Veronese raised the siege. Brescia, Bergamo, Cremona, Parma, Modena, even Milan voluntarily acknowledged him as their feudal sovereign in return for his protection. What Frederick I Barbarossa and Frederick II Wonder of the World had been unable to secure by arms, this king obtained almost by the magic of his name. His dashing wars added terrain to Bohemia, but forfeited the affection of the people, who could not forgive him for being so often absent from their country that he neglected its administration and never learned its speech. In 1336, on a crusade in Lithuania, he contracted a disease that left him blind. Nevertheless, when he learned that Edward III of England had landed in Normandy and was moving toward Paris, John and his son Charles, with 500 Bohemian knights, rode across Europe to succor the King of France. Father and son fought in the van at Crécy. When the French retreated, the blind king bade 2 knights bind their horses on either side to his and lead him against the victorious English, saying, "So will it God, it shall not be said that a king of Bohemia flies from the battlefield." 50 of his knights were killed around him. He was mortally wounded, and was taken dying to the tent of the English king. Edward sent the corpse to Charles with a courtly message. "This day has fallen the crown of chivalry." Charles IV was a less heroic but much wiser king. He preferred negotiation to war, and was not too cowardly to compromise. Yet he extended the boundaries of his kingdom. In the 32 years of his reign, he kept the Slavs and the Germans in unwonted peace. He reorganized the government, reformed the judiciary, and made Prague one of the handsomest cities in Europe. He built there a royal residence on the style of the Louvre, and the famous castle of Karlstein, or Charles's Stone, as a repository for the archives of the state and the jewels of the crown, which were treasured not for vanity and display, but as a reserve fund conveniently mobile and immune to debasements of the currency. He brought in Matthew of Arad to design St. Vitus's Cathedral, and Tommaso da Modena to paint frescoes in churches and palaces. He protected the peasantry from oppression and promoted commerce and industry. He founded the University of Prague in 1347, transmitted to his countrymen the cultural interest that he had acquired in France and Italy, and provided the intellectual stimulus that exploded in the Hussite revolt. His court became the center of the Bohemian humanists, led by Bishop John of Stresa, Petrarch's friend. The Italian poet admired Charles beyond any other monarch of the time, visited him in Prague, and begged him to conquer Italy, but Charles had better sense. His reign, despite his golden bull, was Bohemia's golden age. He survives smiling in a splendid limestone bust in the Cathedral of Prague. Wenceslas IV was a youth of 18 when his father died in 1378. His good nature, his affection for his people, his lenience in taxing them, his skill in administration, won him great favor with all but the nobles, who thought their privileges imperiled by his popularity. His occasional hot temper and his addiction to drink gave them a leverage for displacing him. They surprised him at his country seat, threw him into prison in 1394, and restored him only on his promise to do nothing of moment without the consent of a council of nobles and bishops. New disputes arose. Sigismund of Hungary was called in. He arrested Wenceslas, his brother, and took him prisoner to Vienna in 1402. Wenceslas escaped a few years later, made his way back to Bohemia, was received with joy by the people, and regained his throne and powers. The rest of his story mingles with the tragedy of Huss. 2. John Huss, 1369 to 1415. Wenceslas was loved and hated for winking at heresy and scowling at the Germans. A rapid infiltration of Bohemia by German miners, craftsmen, merchants, and students had generated a racial hostility between Teutons and Czechs. Huss would have received less support from people and king had he not symbolized a native resentment of German prominence. Wenceslas did not forget that the archbishops of Germany had led the movement to depose him from the imperial throne. His sister Anne had married Richard II of England and had seen, probably had sympathized with, the attempt of Wycliffe to divorce England from the Roman Church. In 1388, Adalbert Ranconus left a sum to enable Bohemian students to go to Paris or Oxford. Some of these in England secured or transcribed works by Wycliffe and took them to Bohemia. Milich of Kromierzysz and Konrad Waldhauser roused Prague with their denunciations of immorality in laity and clergy. Matthias of Janov and Thomas of Stytnia continued this preaching. The emperor and even Archbishop Ernst approved, and in 1391 a special church called the Bethlehem Chapel was founded in Prague to lead the movement of reform. In 1402, John Huss was appointed to the pulpit of this chapel. He had begun life in the village of Husinec, and was known as John of Husinec, which he later shortened to Huss. Toward 1390 he came as a poor student to Prague, where he earned his way by serving in the churches. He aimed to enter the priesthood. Nevertheless, after the custom of the age, he joined in what Paris would later term the gay Bohemian ways of university youth. In 1396 he received his degree of Master of Arts and began to teach at the university. In 1401 he was chosen Dean of the Faculty of Arts, that is, of the Humanities. In that year he was ordained priest and reformed his life to an almost monastic austerity. As head of the Bethlehem Chapel, he became the most famous preacher in Prague. Many figures high in the court were among his listeners, and Queen Sophia made him her chaplain. He preached in Czech and taught his congregation to take an active part in the service by singing hymns. His accusers later affirmed that in the very first year of his ministry he had echoed Wycliffe's doubts as to the disappearance of bread and wine from the consecrated elements in the Eucharist. Unquestionably, he had read some of Wycliffe's works. He had made copies of them, which still exist, with his annotations, and at his trial he confessed to having said, "Wycliffe, I trust, will be saved, but could I think he would be damned, I would my soul were with his." In 1403, the opinions of Wycliffe had won such vogue in the University of Prague that the chapter, the administrative clergy, of the cathedral submitted to the university masters 45 excerpts from the writings of Wycliffe and asked should these doctrines be barred from the university. Several masters, including Huss, answered no, but the majority ruled that thereafter no member of the university staff should, either publicly or privately, defend or adhere to any of the 45 articles. Huss must have ignored this prohibition, for in 1408 the clergy of Prague petitioned Archbishop Zbyněk to reprove him. The archbishop proceeded cautiously, being then in conflict with the king. But when Huss continued to express sympathy for Wycliffe's views, Zbyněk excommunicated him and several associates in 1409. And when they persisted in exercising their priestly functions, he placed all Prague under an interdict. He ordered all writings of Wycliffe that could be found in Bohemia to be surrendered to him. 200 manuscripts were brought to him. He burned them in the courtyard of his palace. Huss appealed to the newly elected Pope John the 23rd. John summoned him to appear before the papal court. He refused to go. In 1411, the Pope, desiring funds for a crusade against Ladislas, King of Naples, announced a new offering of indulgences. When this was proclaimed in Prague, and the papal agents seemed to the reformers to be selling forgiveness for coin, Huss and his chief supporter, Jerome of Prague, publicly preached against indulgences, questioned the existence of purgatory, and protested against the churches collecting money to spill Christian blood. Descending to vituperation, Huss called the Pope a money-grubber, even Antichrist. A large section of the public shared Huss's views, and subjected the papal agents to such ridicule and abuse that the king forbade any further preaching or action against the offering of indulgences. 3 youths who violated this edict were haled before the city council. Huss pleaded for them and admitted that his preaching had aroused them. They were condemned and beheaded. The Pope now launched his own excommunication against Huss, and when Huss ignored it, John laid an interdict upon any city where he should stay, this in 1411. On the advice of the king, Huss left Prague and remained in rural seclusion for 2 years. In those years he wrote his major works, some in Latin, some in Czech, nearly all inspired by Wycliffe, some perhaps echoing the heresies and anti-clericalism that a remnant of the Waldensians had brought with them into Bohemia in the 12th and 13th centuries. He rejected image worship, auricular confession, and the multiplication of ornate religious rites. He gave his movement a popular and nationalistic character by denouncing the Germans and defending the Slavs. In a tract on traffic in holy things, he attacked the simony of the clergy. In De Sex Erroribus, he condemned the taking of fees by priests for baptism, confirmation, masses, marriages, or burials. He charged some Prague clerics with selling consecrated oil, and he adopted Wycliffe's view that a priest guilty of simony could not validly administer a sacrament. His treatise De Ecclesia became his apologia and his ruin. From its pages were drawn the heresies for which he was burned. He followed Wycliffe into predestinarianism, and agreed with Wycliffe, Marsilius, and Occam that the Church should have no worldly goods. Like Calvin, he defined the Church neither as the clergy nor as the whole body of Christians, but as the totality, in heaven or on earth, of the saved. Christ, not the Pope, is the head of the Church. The Bible, not the Pope, should be the Christian's guide. The Pope is not infallible, even in faith or morals. The Pope himself may be a hardened sinner or heretic. Accepting a legend widely credited at the time, even by Gerson, Huss made much of a supposititious Pope John VIII, who, said the legend, had revealed her sex by giving unpremeditated birth to a child on the streets of Rome. A pope, Huss concluded, is to be obeyed only when his commands conform to the law of Christ. To rebel against an erring pope is to obey Christ. When a general council met at Constance in 1414 to depose 3 rival popes and enact a program of ecclesiastical reform, a chance seemed open to reconcile the Hussites with the Church. Emperor Sigismund, heir apparent to the childless Wenceslas IV, was anxious to restore religious unity and peace in Bohemia. He suggested that Huss should go to Constance and attempt a reconciliation. For this hazardous journey, he offered Huss a safe conduct to Constance, a public hearing before the council, and a free and safe return to Bohemia in case Huss should reject the judgment of the assembly. Despite the anxious warnings of his associates, Huss set out for Constance in October of 1414, escorted by 3 Czech nobles and several friends. About the same time, Stephen of Palich and other Bohemian opponents of Huss went to Constance to indict him before the council. Arrived, he was at first treated courteously and lived in freedom, but when Palich laid before the council a list of Huss's heresies, they summoned and questioned him. Convinced by his replies that he was a major heretic, they ordered him imprisoned. He fell ill and was for a time near death. Pope John XXIII sent papal physicians to treat him. Sigismund complained that the action of the council violated the safe conduct that he had given Huss. It answered that it was not bound by his action, that his authority did not extend to spiritual concerns, that the Church had the right to overrule the state in trying an enemy of the Church. In April, Huss was removed to the fortress of Gottlieben on the Rhine. There he was placed in fetters, and was so poorly fed that he again fell gravely ill. Meanwhile, his fellow heretic, Jerome of Prague, had rashly entered Constance and had nailed to the city gates, to the doors of churches, and upon the houses of cardinals, a request that the emperor and the council should give him a safe conduct and a public hearing. At the urging of Huss's friends, he left the city and began a return to Bohemia. But on the way, he stopped to preach against the council's treatment of Huss. He was arrested, brought back to Constance, and jailed. On July 5th, after 7 months of imprisonment, Huss was led in chains before the council, and again on the 7th and the 8th. Asked his view of the 45 articles already condemned in Wycliffe's works, he rejected most of them, approved of some. Confronted with extracts from his book, On the Church, he expressed his willingness to recant such as could be refuted from Scripture, precisely the position taken by Luther at Worms. The council argued that Scripture must be interpreted not by the free judgment of individuals, but by the heads of the Church, and it demanded that Huss should retract all the quoted articles without reservation. Both his friends and his accusers pleaded with him to yield. He refused. He lost the goodwill of the vacillating emperor by declaring that a secular as well as a spiritual authority ceases to be a lawful ruler the moment he falls into mortal sin. Sigismund now informed Huss that if the council condemned him, his safe conduct would be automatically cancelled. After 3 days of questioning and vain efforts by the emperor and cardinals to persuade him to recant, Huss was returned to his prison cell. The council allowed him and itself 4 weeks to weigh the matter. It was even more complex to the council than to Huss. How could a heretic be allowed to live without thereby branding as inhuman crimes all past executions for heresy? This council had deposed popes. Was it to be defied by a simple Bohemian priest? Was not the Church the spiritual, as the state was the physical, arm of society, responsible for a moral order that needed some indisputable authority as its base? To assail that authority seemed to the council as clearly treason as to take up arms against the king. Opinion would have to develop through another century before Luther would be able to make a similar defiance and live. Further efforts were made to secure some semblance of retraction from Huss. The emperor sent special emissaries to plead with him. He gave always the same reply. He would abandon any of his views that could be disproved from Scripture. On July 6, 1415, in the Cathedral of Constance, the council condemned both Wycliffe and Huss, ordered Huss's writings to be burned, and delivered him to the secular arm. He was at once unfrocked, and was led out of the city to a place where a pyre of faggots had been prepared. A last appeal was made to save himself with a word of retraction. He again refused. The fire consumed him as he chanted hymns. Jerome, in a forgivable moment of terror, recanted before the council the teachings of his friend on September 10, 1415. Remanded to prison, he gradually regained his courage. He asked for a hearing, and after a long delay he was led before the assembly on May 23, 1416. But instead of being allowed to state his case, he was required first to answer the several charges laid against him. He protested with a passionate eloquence that moved the skeptical but politic Italian humanist Poggio Bracciolini, who had come to Constance as secretary to Pope John XXIII. What iniquity is this, that I, who have been kept in a foul prison for 340 days, without means of preparing my defense, while my adversaries have always had your ears, am now refused an hour to defend myself? Your minds are prejudiced against me as a heretic. You judged me to be wicked before you had any means of knowing what manner of man I was. And yet you are men, not gods, mortals, not eternal. You are liable to error. The more you claim to be held as lights of the world, the more careful you ought to be to prove your justice to all men. I, whose cause you judge, am of no consequence, nor do I speak for myself, for death comes to all. But I would not have so many wise men do an unjust act, which will do more harm by the precedent it gives than by the punishment it inflicts. The charges were read to him one by one, and he answered each without retraction. When at last he was allowed to speak freely, he almost won over the council by his fervor and sincerity. He reviewed some of the historic cases in which men had been killed for their beliefs. He recalled how Stephen the Apostle had been condemned to death by priests, and held that there could hardly be a greater sin than that priests should wrongly slay a priest. The council hoped that he would save himself by asking forgiveness. Instead, he repudiated his earlier recantation, reaffirmed his faith in the doctrines of Wycliffe and Huss, and branded the burning of Huss as a crime certain to be punished by God. The council gave him 4 days to reconsider. Unrepentant, he was condemned on May 30th and was led out at once to the same spot where Huss had died. When the executioner went behind him to light the pyre, Jerome bade him, "Come in front, and light it before my face. If I had feared death, I should never have come here." He sang a hymn till he choked with the smoke. 3. The Bohemian Revolution, 1415 to 1436. The news of Huss's death, relayed by couriers to Bohemia, aroused a national revolt. An assembly of Bohemian and Moravian nobles sent to the Council of Constance on September 2, 1415, a document signed by 500 leading Czechs. It upheld Huss as a good and upright Catholic, denounced his execution as an insult to his country, and proclaimed that the signatories would fight to the last drop of their blood to defend the doctrines of Christ against man-made decrees. A further declaration pledged the members to obey thereafter only such papal commands as agreed with Scripture. The judges of such agreement were to be the faculty of the University of Prague. The university itself hailed Huss as a martyr and praised the imprisoned Jerome. The council summoned the rebellious nobles to appear before it and answer charges of heresy. None came. It ordered the university closed. The majority of masters and students went on with their work. About 1412, one of Huss's followers, Jakubek of Strzeżewo, had proposed that the early Christian custom of administering the Eucharist in both forms, sub utraque specie, wine as well as bread, should be restored throughout Christendom. When the idea captivated the rank and file of his supporters, Huss gave it his approval. The council forbade it and defended the abandonment of the primitive custom on the ground that it risked the spilling of Christ's blood. After Huss's death, the University of Prague and the nobles, led by Queen Sophia, adopted lay communion in both kinds as a command of Christ, and the chalice became the symbol of the Utraquist revolt. The followers of Huss formulated in 1420 the 4 Articles of Prague as their basic demands: that the Eucharist should be given in wine as well as bread, that ecclesiastical simony should be promptly punished, that the Word of God should be preached without hindrance as the sole standard of religious truth and practice, and that an end should be put to the ownership of extensive material possessions by priests or monks. A radical minority among the rebels rejected the veneration of clerics, capital punishment, purgatory, and masses for the dead. All the elements of the Lutheran Reformation were present in this Hussite revolt. King Wenceslas, who had sympathized with the movement, possibly because it promised to transfer church property to the state, now began to fear it as threatening civil as well as ecclesiastical authority. In the new town that he had added to Prague, he appointed only anti-Hussites to the council, and these men issued punitive regulations designed to suppress the heresy. On July 30th, 1419, a Hussite crowd paraded into Newtown, forced its way into the council chamber, and threw the councillors out of the windows into the street, where another crowd finished them off. A popular assembly was organized which elected Hussite councillors. Wenceslas confirmed the new council and then died of a heart attack in 1419. The Bohemian nobles offered to accept Sigismund as their king if he would recognize the 4 Articles of Prague. He countered by demanding from all Czechs full obedience to the Church, and burned at the stake a Bohemian who refused to renounce the lay chalice. The new pope, Martin V, announced a crusade against the Bohemian heretics, and Sigismund advanced with a large force against Prague in 1420. Almost overnight, the Hussites organized an army. Nearly every town in Bohemia and Moravia sent impassioned recruits. Jan Žižka, a 60-year-old knight with one eye, trained them and led them to incredible victories. Twice they defeated Sigismund's troops. Sigismund raised another army, but when a false report came that Žižka's men were approaching, this new host fled in disorder without ever sighting an enemy. Inflated with success, Žižka's Puritans now adopted from their opponents the idea that religious dissent should be suppressed by force. They passed up and down Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia like a devastating storm, pillaging monasteries, massacring monks, and compelling the population to accept the 4 Articles of Prague. The Germans in Bohemia, who wished to remain Catholic, became the favorite victims of Hussite arms. Meanwhile, and for 17 years, from 1419 to 1436, Bohemia survived without a king. Diverse and conflicting elements had united to make the Bohemian Revolution. The native Bohemians resented the wealth and arrogance of the German settlers and hoped to drive them from the country. The nobles coveted ecclesiastical properties and thought them worth an excommunication. The proletariat aspired to free itself from middle-class masters. The middle classes hoped to raise their modest power, as against the nobility, in the Diet that ruled Prague and gave some government to Bohemia. The serfs, especially on church estates, dreamed of dividing those blessed acres, and at worst of freeing themselves from villain bonds. Some of the lower clergy, fleeced by the hierarchy, gave the rebellion their tacit support, and provided for it the religious services interdicted by the Church. When the arms of the Hussites had won them most of Bohemia, the contradictions in their aims broke them into fratricidal factions. After the nobles had seized most of the property owned by Orthodox ecclesiastical groups, they felt that the revolution should subside and invite the sanctifying effects of time. While the serfs who had tilled these lands for the Church clamored for their division among themselves as freemen, the noble appropriators demanded that the peasants should serve the new masters on the same servile basis as before. Žižka supported the peasants, and for a time besieged the now conservative Calixtan or Chalice Hussites in Prague. Tired of the struggle, he accepted a truce, withdrew to eastern Bohemia, and founded a Horeb Brotherhood, dedicated to the 4 Articles and to killing Germans. When he died in 1424, he bequeathed his skin to be made into a martial drum. In the town of Tabor, another party of Hussites formed, who held that real Christianity required a communistic organization of life. Long before Huss, there had been in Bohemia little groups of Waldensians, Begards, and other irrepressible heretics, mingling religious with communistic ideals. They had maintained a salutary quiet until Žižka's troops had overthrown the power of the Church in most of Bohemia. Now they came into the open and captured doctrinal leadership at Tabor. Most of them rejected the real presence, purgatory, prayers for the dead, and all sacraments except baptism and communion, and discouraged the veneration of relics, images, and saints. They proposed to restore the simple ritual of the Apostolic Church and repudiated all ecclesiastical rites and robes that they could not find in early Christianity. They objected to altars, organs, and the splendor of church decoration, and they destroyed such ornaments wherever they could. Like later Protestants, they reduced divine worship to communion, prayer, scriptural readings, a sermon, and the singing of hymns. And these services were conducted by clergymen indistinguishable from the laity in dress. Most of the Taborites deduced communism from millenarianism. Christ would soon come to establish his kingdom on earth. In that kingdom there would be no property, no church or state, no class distinctions, no human laws, no taxes, no marriage. Surely it would please Christ when he came to find such a heavenly utopia already established by his worshippers. At Tabor and some other towns these principles were put into practice. There, said a contemporary professor in the University of Prague, all is held in communion. No one owns anything for himself alone, so to own is considered a deadly sin. They hold that all should be equal brothers and sisters. A Bohemian peasant turned philosopher, Peter Kalchitsky, went further and wrote in vigorous Czech a series of Tolstoyan tracts advocating a pacifistic anarchism. He attacked the powerful and the rich, denounced war and capital punishment as murder, and demanded a society without lords or serfs or laws of any kind. He bade his followers take Christianity literally as they found it in the New Testament, to baptize only adults, to turn their backs upon the world and its ways, upon oaths and learning and class distinctions, upon commerce and city life, and to live in voluntary poverty, preferably tilling the land, and completely ignoring civilization and the state. The Taborites found this pacifism unsuited to their temperament. They divided into moderate and advanced radicals. These preached nudism and a communism of women, and the two factions passed from argument to war. In the course of a few years, unequal abilities developed inequalities of power and privilege, finally of goods, and the apostles of peace and freedom were replaced by ruthless lawgivers wielding despotic force. Christendom heard with horror of this supposedly communistic Christianity. The baronial and burgher Hussites in Bohemia began to yearn for the Church of Rome as the only organization strong enough to stop the imminent dissolution of the existing social order. They rejoiced when the Council of Basel invited reconciliation. A delegation from the council, without papal authorization, came to Bohemia and signed a series of compacts, so worded that complacent Hussites and Catholics could interpret them as accepting and rejecting the 4 Articles of Prague. This in 1433. As the Taborites refused to recognize these compacts, the conservative Hussites joined with the surviving Orthodox groups in Bohemia, attacked and defeated the divided Taborites, and put an end to the communistic experiment in 1434. The Bohemian Diet made its peace with Sigismund and accepted him as king in 1436. But Sigismund, accustomed to crowning his victories with futility, died in the following year. During the chaos that ensued, the Orthodox party secured the upper hand in Prague. An able provincial leader, George of Podebrady, organized an army of Hussites, captured Prague, restored the Utraquist Jan Rokycina to the archiepiscopal see, and established himself as governor of Bohemia in 1451. When Pope Nicholas V refused to recognize Rokycina, the Utraquists meditated a transfer of their allegiance to the Greek Orthodox Church, but the fall of Constantinople to the Turks ended the negotiations. In 1458, seeing that Podebrad's excellent administration had restored order and prosperity, the Diet chose him king. He turned his energies now to reconstituting religious peace. With the approval of the Diet, he sent to Pius II in 1462 an embassy requesting papal ratification of the Compacts of Prague. The Pope refused and forbade the laity anywhere to receive the Eucharist in both kinds. On the advice of Gregor Heimburg, a German jurist, Podebrady in 1464 invited the monarchs of Europe to form a permanent federation of European states, with its own legislature, executive and army, and a judiciary empowered to settle current and future international disputes. The kings did not reply. The reinvigorated papacy was too strong to be defied by a League of Nations. Pope Paul II declared Podebrady a heretic, freed his subjects from their oaths of obedience, and called upon Christian powers to depose him in 1466. Matthias Corvinus of Hungary undertook the task, invaded Bohemia, and was crowned king by a group of Catholic nobles in 1469. Podebrady offered the throne to Ladislas, son of King Casimir IV of Poland. Then, worn out with war and dropsy, he died, aged 51, in 1471. Bohemia, now Czechoslovakia, honors him as, next to Charles IV, her greatest king. The Diet accepted Ladislaus II, and Matthias retired to Hungary. The nobles took advantage of the youthful weakness of the king to consolidate their economic and political power, to reduce the representation of towns and burghers in the Diet, and to debase into serfdom the peasantry that had just dreamed of utopia. Thousands of Bohemians, during this period of revolution and reaction, fled to other lands. In 1485, the Catholic and Utraquist parties signed the Treaty of Kutna-Hora, pledging themselves to peace for 30 years. In eastern Bohemia and Moravia, the followers of Kelchitsky formed in 1457 a new Christian sect, the Jednota Braterska, or Church of the Brotherhood, dedicated to a simple agricultural life on the principles of the New Testament. In 1467 it renounced the authority of the Catholic Church, consecrated its own priests, rejected purgatory and the worship of saints, anticipated Luther's doctrine of justification by faith, and became the first modern church to practice Christianity. By 1500 it claimed 100,000 members. These Moravian brethren were almost exterminated in the fury of the 30 Years' War. They survived through the leadership of John Comenius. They still exist in scattered congregations in Europe, Africa, and America, astonishing a violent and skeptical world with their religious toleration, their unassuming piety, and their peaceful fidelity to the principles they profess. 4. Poland, 1300 to 1505. The maintenance of peace is difficult, even in regions deriving unity and protection from geographical barriers. Consider how much more difficult it is in states exposed on one or more borders, to neighbors always avid, sometimes tempting, sometimes powerful. Poland in the 14th century was half stifled by Teutonic Knights, Lithuanians, Hungarians, Moravians, Bohemians, and Germans, pressing upon her frontiers. This book is continued on Cassette 7, Side 1.